Well, thanks, Jeff, for the introduction. I can't believe it was that many years ago, but it really was. And it's nice to be back in touch with the Children's Cancer Foundation because I don't go back quite as far as you, Jerry, but almost. But it's been a while since I've been connected, and nice to be back, and great to see the work that you started continues. So we're going to switch gears here a little bit, science this morning, and now talk a little bit about the legislative and regulatory issues involved in drug development for pediatric cancer. So no financial disclosures, just a bit of an outline, just somewhat of a case statement for why pediatric drug development is important. Go over the regulations, the pediatric regulations, and the impact of those on pediatric cancer drug development, and some current and future considerations to expedite evaluation and facilitate development. So about 10, 12 years ago, when I was the chair of the Pediatric Subcommittee of the Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee, we put together a series of consensus or series of statements that was part of a consensus statement. The pediatric oncology drug development should generally be coordinated with oncology drug development in general, and as part of the plan for adults. And you'll see that that may actually be happening. The evidence burden for initiating clinical studies in children should include biologic plausibility of the product having activity against a pediatric tumor, and also having sufficient information as to that would allow us to choose an appropriate starting dose, and of course know something about toxicities. So looking at the mechanism of action, and you'll hear more about that later as well. And the current practice would recommend that if a scientific rationale and a population of pediatric cancer patients with no available anti-cancer therapy exist, and we know that there are many of them, then studies in children could in fact be and should in fact be initiated immediately following adult phase 1 studies. So what are the challenges and opportunities? Well, the opportunities, I think, are that with scientific discovery, there are a number of molecular drivers and validated targets that have been identified primarily in adult malignancies, and the opportunity to translate these into pediatric opportunities await us. Available targeted therapies and immunotherapies as well. I think a real opportunity is the infrastructure that exists in pediatric cancer from the perspective of clinical trial networks, and the fact that there's really integration of clinical research, clinical care, and engagement of investigators with patients and families, and advocacy organizations. Technology and big data, and the opportunity to share that big data to construct historical control groups, because we can't do randomized clinical trials to evaluate new drugs like can be done in adult populations. And I think the evolving drug development biomarker or the drug development paradigm will be something that we really need as pediatric oncologists to embrace going forward. And then emerging biomarkers, obviously molecular aberrations as targets and potential enrichment, but then looking at response biomarkers for circulating or using circulating tumor cells or cell-free DNA. So the opportunities are there. The challenges have been there forever, and fortunately, low incidence is one of them. Fortunate for children, difficult for clinical investigators. The heterogeneity of the diseases that we treat, pediatric cancer isn't a single disease, as you know, And within those individual diseases, there's significant heterogeneity, and there are developmental changes that are ongoing throughout the pediatric age group that we have to deal with. Formulation requirements, most new drugs are now oral, and children under the age of 6 don't do well with capsules or pills. So looking at formulations that are going to be pediatric appropriate, being able to actually develop sprinkle formulations that can be either solubilized or mixed with food, which then requires food effect studies as well. Preclinical model and testing limitations, there are some, they're clearly not enough, and there's only the early beginnings of some of these that are actually supported by industry. The financial challenge has been alluded to, I think, small population, small market, not much in the way of an incentive for big pharma. But there are ways to get around that as well. We don't use single drugs to treat children with cancer, so any new drug that's developed, discovered, really has to be done within the context of how is this going to fit into either standard of care or develop a new standard of care, developing combinations, and not only drug combinations, but multimodality with radiation therapy as well. Most of the studies that are done in pediatric oncology are not pre-specified studies with a licensing intent. So we don't do clinical trials, major phase 3 clinical trials with the intent of approving an individual drug. We're looking for opportunities to improve outcomes of patients. There are multiple objectives, multiple questions being asked, and they really don't lend themselves generally to licensing questions and opportunities. And we've always leveraged adult drug discovery and development, and for the time being, I don't see that changing. So as far as approaches, the approaches that we've used for quite some time continue. But we really do need some innovation and some streamlining. I think the evolving drug development paradigm in adults with increasing knowledge of the genomic basis and heterogeneity of pediatric cancers will really allow us to look at studies that are looking for big treatment effects in very small subsets, which is really what's being done in adults with personalized or targeted therapy approaches. We need some compressed drug development timelines in children, like has been done in adults, where studies start out as phase 1 studies with expansion cohorts, and a phase 1 study ends up enrolling 12 or 1,500 patients, and those data come into the FDA for approval, and you bypass the phase 2 studies, the phase 3 studies, and we really need to start thinking about those kinds of streamlined opportunities in kids. And there are limited patient and stakeholder resources. So we've tried at the FDA, and my reason for going there was to actually see if there were opportunities to really facilitate pediatric development, which was not a high priority. But now with the Oncology Center of Excellence that was mandated through the Cancer Moonshot and the 21st Century Cures Act, pediatric drug development and pediatric oncology drug development is clearly a high priority. So we're looking to optimize regulatory authority to the best we can, and to be proactive in identifying promising new drugs and engage with industry and academia to study these products earlier in their development timeline and not wait until drugs are already approved. And then being flexible and harnessing regulatory science to the best we can to meet drug development challenges. So we've talked about some of these targeted therapy opportunities in pediatrics earlier, and you know many, if not most of these, or all of these, but they are listed here, and they're real, and I think they will, in fact, change how we think about study design, study conduct, and what's the appropriate time to actually initiate these studies. So again, as I mentioned, we are still almost obliged because of marketing forces and industry to leverage adult discovery and development. And there are some specific pediatric legislative initiatives. And in fact, prior to 1983, there was nothing in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that actually spoke to studying drugs in children, even though the act was passed in 1938 because of a tragic event involving the use of sulfanilamide in children, where it was actually solubilized with polyethylene glycol, aka antifreeze, and given to children. And there was a significant epidemic of children who were dying. So that really was the impetus for the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But until 1997, there was really not much in the way in the Act that really addressed how drugs could, should, must be developed in children. So in 97, with the Food, Drug Administration Modernization Act, there was the pediatric exclusivity provision, which we'll talk about a little bit more. That was then followed in 2002 by the BPCA, or the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act. And we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. The Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA, in 2003. In 2007, both of those had to be reauthorized, and fortunately, in 2012, with the FDA Innovation Act, these were both actually permanently reauthorized, so we don't have to go through an every 5-year cycle. So PREA authorizes the FDA to require pediatric assessments triggered by any new drug application or biologic licensing application, or a supplement that the new indication, an active ingredient, dosage form, or dosage regimen, or route of administration. Unfortunately, it applies only to indications included in the submission, so most drugs that are developed are for specific adult tumors, which don't occur in pediatrics, and therefore the PREA requirements are waived. Also, drugs with orphan designation are exempted. So now many new, especially targeted drugs, are approved for specific subclasses of what were once rather common adult cancers. They meet the requirements for orphan designation in that they impact less than 200,000 patients per year, and they're exempted from PREA requirements. When those situations are met, when the indication is different, or if it's impossible because of small numbers to actually do studies, then we grant, unfortunately, waivers. So from my perspective, PREA has absolutely no relevance to children with cancer. So we really have to depend almost entirely on the voluntary program, which is the BPCA, or the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, where there's a financial incentive to companies to voluntarily conduct studies under what we call a written request. A sponsor can either request such a written request by submitting a proposed pediatric study request, a PPSR, or sometimes we, on our own, issue a written request usually with input from the investigator, or not usually, but always, because it makes very little sense for us to issue a written request, require a study, if no one's going to do the study. So this is really done collaboratively with academia and the clinical investigator community. And obviously the proposed plan should really contain a rationale for the studies, some detail about study design, and plans for formulation development. So just in summary, both PREA and BPCA apply to both drugs and biologics. This is new because BPCA did not previously. PREA is mandatory, BPCA is voluntary. PREA requires studies only under the indications under review, where studies in BPCA can relate to other indications and may expand the indications, and it provides exclusivity to the entire drug moiety. Orphan indications are exempt from PREA studies. We can do written requests for drugs given orphan status. The pediatric studies must be labeled. That means there must be some information that we can then use in the product labeling. No one reads the labels anyhow, but from the FDA perspective, that's the only way that we can communicate to the public as these things are marketed. So it's always all about labeling. So everything that we review and approve or don't approve has to be reflected in the product labeling. So the same is true for BPCA. So what are the considerations when reviewing agents? What's the public health benefit? Are study designs feasible, sufficient to support dosing, safety, and efficacy? Are there other products already approved for the condition? And we can issue these early. In the very early days of this program, the written requests were issued by the agency years after a drug was approved. In fact, many of the very early written requests were issued for pediatric studies that had been done 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, and drugs that had been approved for quite some time. So we're really trying now to issue these early in the process, even before drugs are approved, and sometimes right after the INDs come in to the agency for review. They can be amended. So we know that even though we describe the studies that are to be done, emerging results may impact development plans. New things may arise, come up on the horizon that make a study of a certain drug either infeasible or not appropriate. Or there may be toxicities or early evidence of lack of efficacy, which would certainly abandon the need to go on and do phase 2 and phase 3 studies. Mechanism of action has always been a key factor, and now with targeted agents, that has become even more critical. Making sure that there's a scientific rationale. Ideally looking for activity in preclinical models of pediatric cancers. That's, again, very limited. I mean, it's primarily limited to the pediatric preclinical testing program, which is funded on a shoestring by the NCI. And with that program, there's only about 6 or 8 agents which can be evaluated every year at the most. Evidence, or at least some suggestion that the therapy is going to have either similar or improved efficacy and less toxicity, and has the potential to improve outcome. So the impact of these in oncology since 2000, there have been 58 written requests issued for evaluation of drugs in the pediatric age group. And 22 of these have resulted in drugs, or not drugs being granted, sponsors being granted marketing exclusivity for those products, which comes at a sizable financial incentive. When I was chair of the COG, we actually provided to GSK the data from our phase 1 and phase 2 studies of docetaxel, which basically gave them an additional 6 months of marketing exclusivity for Taxol, which was worth about $140 million. So these are considerable incentives. So we've also been able to provide language in the labeling for another 17 drugs, and 30 are still under investigation with studies that are outlined in the written requests. Since 2002, all but one of the new drug applications for specific pediatric cancer indications have in fact received FDA approval. So there's always this rumor throughout the community that the FDA hasn't approved a single drug for pediatric cancer in the last 20 years, but that's not quite true. And there are 5 drugs that have been studied under a written request that have actually received approval specifically for a pediatric cancer indication. So, shortening the timeline, you know, what can we do to make things move a little faster? You know, I think more efficient dose-finding studies are really critical. You know, rolling 6 may save a couple of months over 3+3, but we really ought to be looking at other opportunities. Continuous reassessment modeling, where we put 1 patient on a dose level. Do we really need 3? Do we really need 6? I think we could move things much faster, and we could probably actually look at modeling and the use of allometric scaling to come up with dosing designs without enrolling 30 patients on a phase 1 study to arrive at a recommended phase 2 dose. And why can't we just use the adult recommended phase 2 dose when there's no adult maximum tolerated dose? And there's already experience both in oncology and outside of oncology where this does appear to be a reasonable approach. I think expanding first in pediatric study sites and improving patient access and improving the opportunity for patients to be enrolled on early phase studies is something that really needs to be considered. I know there are people at the NCI who feel very differently about this, and I recognize the need, having run the phase 1 consortium in CCG for 10 years, that there is a need for communication, for adherence to protocol, for data capture, and for monitoring safety. But I think we've come a long way in pediatric oncology that even the smaller centers could, in fact, enroll patients on early phase studies. I think the other opportunities that now present themselves are looking at histology agnostic development. And you know, why pediatric patients with tumors that are driven by the same molecular aberrations as lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer can't be enrolled on those studies. And there's recent approval history now with pembrolizumab and with avelumab for MSI-high tumors, irrespective of site of origin or histology. So both adult and pediatric approvals, as well as the approval in children of avelumab for Merkel cell carcinoma. Adaptive designs with disease cohorts, I think, are something that really are being considered and need to be fostered a bit more. Master protocols and actually embedding pediatric trials within adult studies. So we actually have issued a written request for a study of EGFR receptor antibody in high-grade gliomas that'll probably enroll 3 pediatric patients. But it's within the context of the adult study, and it's clearly a much more efficient way of doing things. including pediatric cohorts on select first-in-human studies, so we really have to wait until an adult phase 1 study is completed, and then start the process all over again and write a protocol that's specifically for a pediatric study, when you could prospectively include a pediatric cohort once you have sufficient adult toxicity experience and some adequate dosing information in adults, so that there's the potential for clinical benefit for children enrolled on a phase 1 study. And then we've recently put ourselves on record as saying that we strongly recommend that adolescent patients be enrolled on relevant disease-specific trials. I mean, I think it's still unconscionable that brentuximab vedotin is approved for a disease that has its peak incidence in adolescents, and the drug still isn't approved for adolescents or children. So master protocols, I think with the pediatric match, I think it's something that everyone is becoming more familiar with. Clearly, in adult drug development with I-SPY and the lung map, this really makes a great deal of sense, having a single protocol, central governance structure, central IRB, data monitoring committee. It allows the study of multiple drugs targeting more than one marker or tumor, or more than one drug for a marker or tumor, again, across a variety of different histologies. I think it also provides an opportunity for leveraging common control groups, and it's adaptive because it provides an opportunity to either add or remove agents as you move on. So we have within our office the BPCA Pediatric Oncology Working Group. There are now about 15 pediatric oncology medical officers in our office, as well as in the Center for Biologics. We have quarterly meetings with key opinion leaders in the academic community to discuss promising new agents for pediatric evaluation through the written request mechanism. We also, in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, coordinate a monthly pediatric cluster call with international regulators, with the EMA, the PMDA in Japan, TGA in Australia, and Health Canada, to talk about specific products, development, safety concerns, and general scientific issues around the pediatric investigation plans, the PIPs that are required in the European Union, and our pediatric study plans and written requests in the US. So not that they necessarily have to be the same, but so that we're not recommending to sponsors to do conflicting, competing studies, and when we can actually recommend international trials, a single international trial, we do that as well. So one of the reasons for the BPCA working group is to actually have sponsors recommended and products recommended that we can bring to the pediatric subcommittee of the ODAC. This is a mandated meeting under the reauthorization of BPCA, so we have to meet at least once a year. Previously, this was a forum to just talk about the challenges with drug development in pediatric oncology. And I went to so many meetings where we talked about the same thing every time, and nothing ever changed. It was the same challenges years after year. But we've now changed the focus here, where we actually invite sponsors of products that we think have a potential in pediatrics to come and present, gauge investigator interest, select possible drug candidates for written requests, provide feedback during those meetings with respect to trial design within the regulatory framework. And it's really an interactive discussion on trial design, specific agents, and specific diseases. So we like this to happen as early in the drug development timeline and even prior to new drug application submissions. We have a meeting coming up in a couple weeks where there are 3 products where there has not yet been an NDA submitted. They're still just in the IND stage. I think these are all products that have potential relevance to pediatric cancer, and will give us an opportunity to discuss these early and issue written requests if necessary. So we also encourage sponsors to seek an invitation, and they've actually, over the last couple of years, been very interested in having this opportunity. It's a little bit of a problem in that these are required to be open public meetings. Sometimes we have to be a little bit careful in the background documents that they submit, and they don't want proprietary information released to the Federal Register. But there are ways to get around that. But I think these meetings are making a difference. More recently, looking at ways to expand the authority of PREA is something that we are involved in. We're not supposed to be actively involved in this, but it's a little difficult for us not to be. So rather than making the requirement for a pediatric study the indication, actually having the requirement be mechanism of action, or in the case of molecularly targeted drugs, if a molecular mechanism of action would be relevant to a pediatric cancer, then there would be a requirement to study that drug under PREA. So BRAF inhibitors, MEK inhibitors, ALK inhibitors, if there's evidence that they are involved in either the causation or progression of a childhood cancer, then there would be a requirement to study them. So the language is there, proposed PREA amendment to require that certain drugs. The language is undergoing change, and as we speak, it's being marked up. It was hoped to be part of the 21st Century Cures Act. It's now probably going to make it today, in fact, into at least the Senate Energy and Commerce Committee to be included in the PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act negotiations. And we've been talking, although we're not supposed to be, but providing some technical assistance to the Senate Help Committee to try and get their buy-in as well. So this is the RACE Act, the Research Acceleration for Cure and Equity for Children Act. As I mentioned, it was originally supposed to be part of the 21st Century Cures, and hopefully it will, in fact, get submitted as part of PDUFA 6. As you can imagine, there's quite a bit of opposition to this by the pharmaceutical industry because they see a requirement for studies, more studies than they would like to do. And I think we've assured them, or at least have tried, and we certainly can through guidance, that we're not going to be requiring studies in every single drug where the molecular mechanism of action is promising. And particularly in the case of multiple in-class drugs, there's no way we can study all of them in children. So we'll have to have some transparent process by which we can discuss these and decide which should move forward. So that really addresses the challenge of drugs that are developed for adult cancers and how we might be able to use them in children. But the real challenge is addressing those drugs when no adult indication exists. So looking at inhibitors of the fusion proteins that we know drive many pediatric cancers, MLL rearrangements, EWS FLY1, there is no current legislative fix. And we really need to look at new ways to provide meaningful and early incentives to industry. There is the Pediatric Rare Disease Priority Review Vouchers, and these have in fact been successful in some areas. It was a Rare Disease Priority Review Voucher was awarded to United Therapeutics for its development of Unituxin, but really that drug was in the very late stages of development by the time United Therapeutics got involved. But it's a huge financial incentive, several $100 million that they were able to sell this for. I think there are also opportunities that should be leveraged for more public-private partnerships and the role of NCI and other funding bodies. And public-private partnerships, I think, are especially important when there are drugs that are discontinued by sponsors because of failed activity in the adult cancer for which they were developed, but when there's potential promising activity in one or more pediatric tumors. And then the other thing that I think is not well appreciated is the Orphan Drug Act and how it, in fact, could benefit pediatric cancer drug development. So the Orphan Drug Act was passed in 1983 to promote product development for rare diseases. Rare diseases are defined as affecting less than 200,000 people per year in the U.S. It's a designation, and it's a designation given to drugs with promising clinical efficacy. There are major financial incentives here. There's an exemption from PDUFA costs, PDUFA, Prescription Drug User Fee Act. The FDA charges sponsors to review applications. So although we're a government agency and we have a budget, most of our budget isn't derived from funds from the Department of Health and Human Services, but actually are derived from the fees that are charged to sponsors for reviewing applications. And last year, they amounted to about $2.5 million. And for FY17 and beyond, they're still under negotiation. So orphan designation of a drug exempts a sponsor from that $2.5 million review fee. They also get a 50% tax credit for any clinical study costs. They get 7 years of marketing exclusivity. So with the BPCA exclusivity at 6 months, this is 7 years, which is obviously considerably longer. And sponsors are eligible actually for orphan grants, and they are approximating about $14 million a year, which can also cover both clinical trial costs as well as preclinical development costs. So I think this is something that really could benefit pediatric oncology drug development. A third of all the new molecular entities and 2/3 of the biologic licensing applications have orphan designation. Nearly 40% of all oncology drugs for the last couple of years have received orphan designation. There's the same approval standards for safety and effectiveness, but there's allowable regulatory flexibility in the use of scientific judgment. And there's very substantial clinical trial design and diversity. So as the gold standard for doing clinical trials and for endpoints that will result in approval is looking at either progression-free survival and preferably overall survival in a randomized setting. Many of the studies for orphan drugs are in single-arm studies, and they can use surrogate endpoints as long as they've been validated or the study is in the process of validating them. So I think going forward, maximizing and fully leveraging the authority that we have under BPCA to issue written requests early, to hopefully see a change in PREA, which may create some difficulties for both industry as well as investigators and regulators, but we'll need to work together to sort of overcome those hurdles. I think developing a rational science-based strategy for prioritizing which new products to study and what diseases and timing, and again, this relates to same-in-class drugs, second generation, third generation ALK inhibitors. Expand opportunities for precision medicine approaches, and really reevaluate the existing paradigm for dose determination and early toxicity assessment in pediatrics. Increasing integration of pediatric development plans into adult development strategies when appropriate. Several years ago, meeting with sponsors at a sponsor meeting, no one would have ever thought about bringing up the issue of what about children? And now we do it all the time. It's really a requirement. Can adolescents be enrolled on this study? Why not? What are your pediatric development plans? Promote data sharing and use of big data to construct historical controls. We can use historical controls. It's a myth that the FDA doesn't allow them. We frequently don't allow them because they're usually worthless. But constructing a good historical control has real benefit. And who, more than pediatric oncologists who have been doing clinical trials for decades, have the history with which to build these. So I think it's really a missed opportunity for us. I think we can take advantage of the current FDA commitment to look at patient-centered drug development and look at clinical outcome assessments, patient-reported outcomes. Although difficult in children, I think we can't leave children behind, just like everything else. I think there are opportunities to start looking at pediatric PROs to evaluate both toxicity as well as efficacy, looking at things like functional status and improvement, as well as just extending survival. And always expanding collaboration. So collaboration with patients and families, investigators, industry, advocates, and regulators. We all have to be on the same page here, and I think that's really going to be necessary in the future. So with that, BPCA is currently the only legislative mechanism. Written requests have resulted in approvals and informative labeling. We've got to get beyond that. The barriers include waivers for mandatory requirements. So hopefully changes in the PREA legislation will change that and get rid of the orphan exemption as well. And then new approaches to increased collaboration. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
So I was intrigued to hear you talk about the public-private partnerships for reviving drugs that have been abandoned by industry, because I think almost anybody who's been doing research in pediatric oncology for a while can point to several promising drugs in their field that have been abandoned. So, for example, one drug that just springs to mind is Abataclax, which was abandoned by Teva because it caused CNS issues with administration. As a brain tumor doctor, that's exactly what I want to see in terms of getting good brain penetration. And that drug, for all the world, is dead to everybody, but could be very useful in those type of things. So I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on reviving those kind of drugs.
Well, I mean, we're not in the business, unfortunately, of reviving. So it really having said that, we can certainly facilitate the process and listen to public and private partnerships. The ones that come to my mind that have been successful are, again, the Unituxin or dinutuximab, which was a drug for which there was no sponsor. The product was made by the NCI for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, and there was no budget to continue it. So they licensed the drug to a corporate entity who then further developed it. So I think they're the kinds of opportunities. The IGF-1 receptor antibody that had a great deal of early promise in Ewing's actually was abandoned by the sponsor, and there are opportunities where the NCI is picking that up, but again, it's temporary. I mean, the NCI isn't a drug manufacturing and distributing company, but those kinds of partnerships can actually result in things going forward, and we're historically bound by many failed products that have been very disappointing that we couldn't get our hands on them to study in children because they just sort of disappeared.
Dr. Reaman, you've reviewed the regulatory and legislative challenges in front of the FDA. My question relates to budgetary. With the proposed federal budget in front of Congress, that calls for considerable cuts to HHS and agencies like yourselves. What's the game plan? What if, in fact, the budget proposal were enacted and those cuts were implemented? How would the agency continue to do the business that it does, or are there alternatives to that? What kind of strategy is there?
Well, I think our agency will be somewhat protected by the fact that not all of our funds come from the federal budget. I think for us to succeed, the president just has to say, well, we'll increase the PDUFA fees by $1 million, and therefore the FDA can continue doing what it's doing. At least that's the expectation. The bigger problem is what's going to happen to supporting the clinical trial infrastructure that's supported by the NCI, and that's where more private support is going to be required, both from philanthropic organizations as well as industry. I mean, industry is the one that ultimately benefits from this. So shouldn't there be a little bit more industry involvement in developing and studying and evaluating drugs in children? They certainly support adult clinical trials and support them very, very handsomely. Some of that I think should spill over into the pediatric arena.
So first of all, congratulations on changing the landscape, being part of the change of landscape that's occurred over the last 5 years. It's really palpable that as people out there kind of talking to pharmaceutical companies, they're thinking of pediatrics in the same breath as they're thinking of other things. And that's simply because of the incentives that have been set up. If you incentivize something, it happens. And so I just wanted to congratulate you and let you know that it is a success. The pharma companies are considering pediatrics now very early. A couple of things that I've noticed. Durvalumab is one of the PD-L1 inhibitors that was recently FDA approved for bladder cancer. And it turns out 2 different companies have the rights to market that for different indications. So there's one company that is marketing for the solid tumors, and another company, turns out to be Celgene, that's marketing it for heme malignancies where it hasn't gotten an indication yet.
Right.
Is that a model that you see more of, and could that kind of spreading of interest, risk, potential benefits really benefit pediatrics? One of those companies has a great track record partnering with academia, and the other doesn't, and I was just wondering whether that's something we could potentially be seeing more of.
I think it's something that we'll probably be seeing more of, these sort of shared development strategies between sponsors and sort of splitting the market, if you will, with respect to indications. I think it could help us in pediatrics, but it's pretty much dependent on the specific indications. You know, if it's going to be something that is approved for Hodgkin's disease or some non-Hodgkin lymphoma indication that, you know, maybe has relevance to children, then I think it could be of benefit, but otherwise I'm not so sure.
Short question.
Yes, it's a whole. I mean, it's a biologic, so it's not too different from moving from small molecules to monoclonal antibodies. But the cell products and tissue and gene therapies and engineered cell products are actually all part, or all have oversight by the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and not the Center for Drugs Evaluation and Research. One of the reasons for the Oncology Center of Excellence was to really bring the review of drug products, biologic products, including cell and gene therapies, and diagnostics and therapeutic devices all under review in one place. So we've been very, very heavily involved, at least from the pediatric perspective, of cell product applications that are in from industry. And I think that will only continue.
So I just have one quick question. It's
Yep.
interesting. So given the number of orphan projects moving forward, and given that virtually every cancer is going to fall into the orphan category, do you think that the 200,000 threshold is too high, and is it getting diffused out too much, or and should it be lowered given how we're now subcategorizing the tumors?
I think it's a good question. I mean, you know, the 200,000 is historical, and it has no relevance necessarily to cancer. It actually started, I think, with inborn errors of metabolism and genetic abnormalities. But I think, and the 200,000 is also prevalence and not incidence. So it's kind of difficult to answer that question, but I think 200,000 is just a number, and we can sort of work around the numbers. And I think what's important for us is that this orphan exemption, for us, when I say us, I mean for pediatric oncology drug development, is to get rid of this orphan exemption because it means that any drug that really is molecularly targeted and the approval is for a very enriched population won't be available or won't be required to be studied in children, which I think is a mistake. So that's the big thing. So right now, lowering it, I would just leave it where it is, but we just have to get rid of that exemption.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.